The ships waited in the bay like patient beasts of steel, their smokestacks breathing thin gray ribbons into the California sky. The year was 1946, and America was exhaling after years of fire. The war was over. The camps were emptying. The Red Cross called it repatriation, a word that promised closure but often delivered confusion. For most, the meaning was simple: pack your things, go home. But for hundreds of Japanese women standing at the docks that summer, home had become an uncertain word. Some clutched letters from the War Department, others held photographs worn to blur. They were the last civilians from internment centers and POW compounds, sent aboard the ships bound for a homeland they no longer recognized. One woman, small and quiet, kept smoothing her dress though there was no crease left to find. Her name was not recorded in any file, but her story echoed in many hearts. She had once worked in a Colorado camp kitchen, stirring soup beside an American nurse who'd shared recipes and cigarettes in secret. Now, with her ship ticket folded in her palm, she couldn't lift her feet toward the gangway. The announcements blared. The final roll call was read. The women hesitated, their silhouettes trembling in the harbor's mist. Some stepped forward, but most did not. They stood watching as the sailors drew the ropes and the horns sounded long and low, notes that seemed to ask if they were certain. By sunset, the ships slid into the horizon, their wakes curling like silver scars across the sea. Behind them, the women remained, the salt wind tangling in their hair, the silence growing heavier than the ocean itself. What could not be seen that day were the memories anchoring them. The camps, though fenced and foreign, had offered something Japan could no longer promise: stability. In the chaos after the atomic bombings, cities were ash and family registers unreadable. Some of these women had received letters months apart, one telling them their parents survived, another telling them they hadn't. The inconsistency became its own grief. Here, at least, they knew the rhythm of things: the whistle at dawn, the scent of soap, the predictable kindness of the same guard bringing rations. Records from the War Relocation Authority mention over 6,000 Japanese detainees still in the United States after VJ Day, including more than 1,000 women. Within 6 months, nearly 60% of them refused repatriation. Official forms labeled their decision as voluntary deferment, as if homecoming were simply postponed. But many had already made a quiet, irreversible choice. In one Oklahoma camp, a woman named Aiko was seen planting tomatoes in the red soil outside her barracks. "I will harvest them in America," she joked. The guard laughed but noted it anyway. There was something disarming about her certainty. When the time came for departure, she simply didn't appear at the gate. Others followed suit: a nurse in Utah who stayed to work at a veterans hospital, a translator who married the farmer who once delivered food to the camp. Each story was a thread pulled from the fabric of war, weaving a softer pattern in its place. Of course, there were whispers. Newspapers called them forgotten women, as though memory itself had misplaced them. Some Americans saw their presence as a curiosity, others as an act of quiet defiance. But to the women themselves, staying was not rebellion, it was mercy. One told an interviewer years later, "In Japan, I had ghosts. Here I had soil." Her words carried the weight of both sorrow and survival. On the docks, after the ships vanished, the women drifted into the evening light. A Red Cross officer passed out ration biscuits and weak coffee, saying, "Next ship will come in September." It never did. By the time autumn arrived, those same women had scattered, some to work in canneries, others to take domestic jobs in farmhouses that still smelled of dust and cornmeal. The fences were gone, but their boundaries had shifted inward, invisible yet real. There were small ironies in their new lives. The same uniformed men who once guarded them now held doors open at bus stations. Local women who had scowled at them for years began asking for sewing lessons. One former internee wrote in a diary later found in an Iowa attic, "Freedom tastes like cold milk from a bottle. I didn't know it could be so ordinary." Still, nostalgia clung to them like a scent. When trains passed at night, some women imagined the ocean's hum, the possibility of home across it. Yet the longer they stayed, the quieter that longing became. Children were born. Friendships took root. The Japanese language faded from their dreams, replaced by English lullabies sung softly to half-American babies. One winter evening in 1947, A woman walking near the same harbor where the ships had once stood found a torn ticket stub pressed into the mud. She picked it up, brushed it clean, and slipped it into her coat pocket. "The ship stopped waiting," she murmured, not bitterly, but with the peace of someone who understood finality. By then, the government had ceased recording names. The story of these women became rumor more than record, whispered across states, tucked between census lines and baptism registries. Some said they vanished into marriage, others said they simply disappeared into the vast quiet of rural America. But traces remained. In a photograph found in a Kansas farmhouse, in a recipe scribbled on the back of a ration slip, in the faint accent of a woman teaching Sunday school in Oregon. They were no longer prisoners, nor quite citizens. They belonged to the in-between, that delicate space where history forgets to label people. Yet perhaps that was their victory. In staying, they rewrote the ending that war had prepared for them. The Pacific kept its distance, patient and unknowing, while the prairies bloomed around them. And though no ships returned for them again, sometimes, on quiet mornings when the wind carried the smell of salt and wheat mixed together, they swore they could still hear the horns across the water, calling them by names they no longer answered to. But what came next, in the years that followed, would change not only their lives but the very meaning of what it was to be American. The Kansas wind had a way of making even silence sound alive. It rolled across the wheat fields like a whisper, bending the stalks as if bowing to something unseen. In the middle of it stood a woman once listed in an army file as female detainee, repatriation deferred. Now she was simply called Mary. The name wasn't hers by birth. An American farmer's wife had chosen it after struggling to pronounce her Japanese one. Mary never corrected her. It was easier to let the old syllables fade than to remind people of what the war had taught them to fear. She had stayed behind when the others sailed home. The farmer, a widower named Jack, had offered her work on his land after the camp shut down. She cooked, mended, and harvested wheat with the same quiet precision that once kept her alive behind fences. But what began as employment turned into something harder to define. Mutual dependence born of loneliness and unspoken gratitude. Jack, who had lost a son in the Pacific, found comfort in her stillness. Mary, who had lost nearly everything else, found in him a kind of calm that didn't ask for explanations. Every morning, she woke before dawn to light the stove. The first smell of the day was always coffee, bitter, sharp, and reassuringly American. She still preferred green tea, but she learned to drink it black and strong, the way Jack did. They rarely talked about the war. When the radio mentioned Japan, he would lower the volume, and she would keep her eyes on her hands, folding bread dough that rose and fell like the steady breathing of forgiveness. Outside, the neighbors watched with curiosity. Some whispered that Jack had lost his mind, others said he was a saint. But in that small Kansas town, gossip eventually tired itself out, and Mary became another face behind a screen door, waving at passing trucks, tending chickens, laughing softly at the children who called her Miss Maryson. The accent lingered, but the fear did not. There were other women like her scattered across America then, ghosts of the war turned gardeners, nurses, and cooks. One in Utah opened a small laundry. Another in Oregon taught children to make paper cranes from old ration forms. Their quiet presence became a kind of rebellion against the old divisions. While politicians argued about reparations and historians cataloged battles, these women were building something simpler, belonging. Still, peace didn't come easily. Some nights, Mary woke sweating, hearing the echo of ship horns in her dreams. Once, she found a letter from the Japanese government offering transport home. The envelope smelled faintly of sea salt. She stared at it for hours, her thumb tracing the red stamp. Then she burned it in the stove. The flame flared, devoured the paper, and died. The next morning, she planted a tree where the ashes had cooled, a young maple that grew fast and stubborn in the Kansas soil. By 1950, America had changed its shape. The same nation that had once feared her kind now hungered for the culture they brought. Soldiers returning from occupation duty in Japan spoke fondly of the food, the politeness, the order. Newspapers ran stories about ex-enemies turned neighbors. A congressman even joked, "They came to surrender, and now they're teaching us manners." Beneath the humor was truth, the quiet integration of people who had no homeland but refused to vanish. Mary's English improved. She began reading recipes in Ladies' Home Journal and combining them with the dishes of her past, meatloaf seasoned with soy sauce, apple pie crust brushed with sesame oil. Jack pretended not to like it, then asked for seconds. On Sundays, she attended church with him, sitting in the back pew. When the congregation sang, she mouthed the words, her voice small but steady. Someone once asked if she believed in God. She smiled and said, "I believe in mornings." Her son, born 2 years after the war's end, was the bridge neither country expected. At school, teachers called him the quiet boy who can draw. At home, he listened to his mother hum Japanese lullabies and his father tell stories about corn prices and rain. He didn't know which side of the ocean he belonged to, but he never had to choose. For Mary, that was victory enough. Years passed, and the scars of war grew soft around the edges. The maple tree she planted reached higher each season, its leaves burning red every autumn as if remembering the fires she left behind. When neighbors asked about her past, she spoke in fragments, a camp, a long wait, a ship that never came. No bitterness colored her tone, only distance, as if the story belonged to someone else. One summer evening, decades after she first stepped onto that Kansas farm, Mary stood watching her grown son teach his daughter to ride a bicycle. The air was gold with dust and laughter. Jack had long since passed, buried beneath the same tree she'd planted from the ashes of that letter. The branches swayed above her, strong and full, casting shadows shaped like open hands. She reached up, touched the bark, and felt the rough pulse of a life that had taken root where it wasn't meant to. In the end, she thought, perhaps staying was never about defiance. It was about choosing stillness over loss, life over memory. She whispered a word she hadn't spoken in years, her real name, and it didn't sound foreign anymore. The wind carried it away, soft and sure, across the plains. That night, as the crickets began their steady chorus and the stars climbed high over Kansas, a faint echo drifted through her window, the low hum of something vast and distant, like a ship horn buried in memory. She opened her eyes and smiled, knowing the sound wasn't a call to leave, but a reminder of how far she had already come. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.